So next we're going to talk about streamlining assessment systems and how to leverage real-time student data. So I'm very excited about this. We have two really good presenters that are going to come up, and unfortunately we have lost one. So our Secretary of Education from Indiana, Katie Jenner, many of you know Katie was going to join us in person, but she was not able to. And so we have in her place the Chief Academic Officer, Lynn Schemel, from the Indiana Department of Education. And then we also have Kunjan Narechania. And Kunjan is the Chief Executive Officer for Watershed Advisors. And I'm going to, no, I said that wrong. I just said it right when I was talking to Kunjan, not Acharya. So I'm going to ask Kunjan and I'm going to ask Lynn to come to the stage. We are running about 10 minutes behind, so I'm going to skip part of their introduction and let them go just right into their work, because I'm sure they would rather talk about the work than the introduction. So I'm going to invite you to go ahead and come to the stage.
All right. Good afternoon. Great to see you all, and great to be here. Thanks to CCSSO for having us. So I am a former math teacher. I taught middle school math, and I really wish that in my district and in my state, we had those principles that CCSSO put up at the top of this session. The first one being pick good instructional materials. The second one being train teachers on those materials. The third one being align supplemental time. And then ensuring that you have assessments that help measure student learning so that you can better use the instructional materials and your supplemental and intervention time to support students. And that's what we're here to talk about today, assessment. And so welcome, Lynn. So happy to have you. And congrats on all the work that you've been doing in Indiana. Can you tell us what it is that sort of has sparked for you the work that you guys are doing to make assessment more accessible to teachers and the data from assessment more useful to teachers?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me today. And Dr. Jenner sends her regrets. She's here, but she fell ill while we've been here. So I'll try to do her justice here. So yeah, there's a number of things right now with where we're at in the state of Indiana. We know that our educators and our families for a long time have desired actionable data, data that's timely, that they can act upon, tied to professional development and resources. They want less testing time. They want informative reports for families so that families can understand what their students know and can do. They can seek extra help if needed. And then professional development around all of those resources tied to instructional supports. Currently, much like many of you in Indiana, we have the summative, we have the end of year assessment. And we do a lot of medical analogies when we talk about our assessments. And so when we think about our current state of assessments with the summative, we think about it as an autopsy. So we're dissecting at the end of the year, this is what happened. Oh, if we had known this, we could have done this. Well, now those students have, matriculated to that next grade level, and maybe they're in a different school, so we can't always help support them. We can inform program evaluation, but again, it wasn't timely or actionable. Our state legislature has offered us some opportunities. In 2022, they passed legislation which required us to reduce our standards by 22%, and then streamline our standards by 25%, and then prioritize no more than 33% of those as essential standards. And then most recently, last year, they opened up the possibility for us to move to a through-year assessment system, which is what we're moving towards. And then most recently with the NAEP results, it just affirmed that we need to do something different. So in math, just to kind of set the stage, we previously were 11th ranked in both 4th and 8th grade. We're now 9th and 13th respectively. We went up 1 point with our average scale score in 4th grade math, while the nation went up 2. And then we went down 1 in 8th grade, much like the nation, but we still see our most struggling students are falling farther behind when we look at how they did in relation to their counterparts.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about your through-year assessment? What used to happen and what happens now if you're a classroom teacher?
Yeah, so part of what I just mentioned about the legislator expanding the legislation to move beyond a summative assessment is that they have opened up that opportunity for us to do a through-year model. And so, like I mentioned, we have the summative, that autopsy. And so as we were thinking about what do we want this new model to look like, we thought about, is it a diagnostic? Do we go deep on every single standard multiple times of the year? Or do we think about it more like a check-in when we go to our annual checkup? We're looking at, just various areas. And then if there's an issue, then we can go deeper. We can, diagnose and do more testing. So that's the model that we went with. We looked at a lot of opportunities about multiple modules, pre and post test, but our theory of action is about opportunity to learn. So we have 3 checkpoints and a summative. Those checkpoints are focused on those essential standards that I mentioned. The great thing about our model is that we have had a lot of feedback. We sent out a survey in April of 23 asking all school corporations and non-public schools in our state for information about where they taught the standards. And so we took all that data back in, and it fell really nicely, to be honest. There was a lot of commonalities, and then those areas where there wasn't, we had various educator committees. We went back out for public comment. We also have studied the research and data around learning progression, so that helped to inform us with it. But it's really given us a state scope and sequence. And we can support around that a lot better than if all corporations and districts and schools, non-public schools, are doing different things. In January of 2024, then we sent out another survey asking for schools to opt in. And so this was really kind of like, okay, we've given a lot of information out. What do we think the schools, we're trying to respond to their needs. Do we think that there's buy-in? And so my assistant director and I, we kind of joked, do we think we'll get 50 schools? We got 1,350 schools. 75% of our state opted in to our opt-in, our pilot this year. And so that's been really exciting. In September then of this last year, we began and we thought, okay, are those 75% still going to come through for us? And they did. And so we had 360,000 students participate, both in math and ELA. And it was across the board in grades 3 through 8. We had about 75% of the students at each grade level. So it's been great representation, great feedback to really help drive our work of redesigning our resources, creating assessment frameworks, instructional frameworks, intervention frameworks. And just like what Arkansas shared, this has really given us the opportunity as we've redeveloped these resources. We had to. When we took away 25% of our standards, it affected everything. And so it gave us the opportunity then to show educators, families, and students what proficiency is, what's expected. Because we shouldn't be surprised if we haven't shown them. Then we get our end of the year results, and if they were only teaching at the approaching proficiency level or their curricular materials, that's what the level they were, we shouldn't be surprised then if we're not hitting the mark.
So your system gives teachers information more often and usable information that helps them adjust instruction and inform parents about how kids are performing. One thing that I hear from teachers a lot, and I certainly experienced as a teacher myself, is that there are a lot of assessments that are required by districts, by my school, and then by the state. And I would spend a lot of time assessing, but not always using that data or knowing how to use that data. So how are you in Indiana thinking about helping streamline for teachers which assessments matter most, and how does that connect to the system that you all have built?
Yeah, so I think this is going to continue to be a conversation because while we have our state assessments, there's also many things that are happening locally, and change is hard. And so we've had a lot of conversations around this with schools and corporations, and I recently had a school that wanted to meet with me and said, we want to share some concerns about the through year, and so I said, okay, happy to meet with you. And So we got on this call and they said, it is taking us 5 to 6 weeks for assessment 3 times a year. And I'm like, wait. These checkpoints are designed to be one class period, about a 45-minute. What can you tell me more? What's happening? And as they talked, they were saying that they had opted in, so they were piloting our checkpoints. They were still giving their formative assessments. They were giving their classroom assessments and school and corporation assessments. They also had county assessments that they were giving. And so it was a great conversation that we had that talked about, okay, what data, is each one of these giving to you? And what might you consider eliminating because you're getting this, and then what action can you take it? So it really opened up great conversations, but it's designing those resources to support. So one of the areas, and Lindsay mentioned this earlier when she shared what's happening in Indiana, is that there's a numeracy preferred screener that's part of one of our legislative bills. And so we're also designing some of these same supports around those screeners. We just adopted a reading preferred screener, so it's giving us that opportunity. So again, assessments are as aligned as possible if they're not ours, and then our resources are aligned, and so that's helping then educators in the classroom, so there's not so many different ways that they're being pulled. And then just, reducing the time. It's a 9-week window for each one of our checkpoints, so there's flexibility. So schools don't have to close down for 2 weeks to give our assessment. It's helping to define the scope and sequence. We've got a second opportunity built in, so as we point to interventions and resources, students can be reassessed then to know if they're hitting that mastery mark.
I think what you're describing, that anecdote, is so helpful, because I've heard a couple of states who have asked districts to do something similar, which is do an audit of all the assessments that you give in your district that are in addition to what is asked at the state. And, in my conversation with those states, they are so surprised to see how many, and actually the district leaders are surprised too, at how many assessments teachers are being asked to take. So I just think the question you asked them makes so much sense. I know that, this is a little bit of a related question. I know that, at the state, we don't have control over what happens in the districts necessarily. But what are other ways you're helping your districts to make sure that their assessment systems are coherent and make sense in line with the state system?
Yeah, so I think it just goes back to talking about what each of the components are, what the data they're getting, the resources that we're sharing, the professional development around it. Again, what does proficiency look like, and ensuring that we have HQCM is what we call it in Indiana, much like some of the rest of you have. So it's just incorporating all of those components into one. It's so much more than just the assessment itself.
And can you just describe a little bit about the tools and resources that you've created alongside the assessment that help paint the picture of proficiency that you're talking about?
Yeah, so it all starts, and I was previously a curriculum director for a long time, and so this is what I really get excited about, is that it starts with the assessment framework and knowing that scope and sequence to kind of plan out your curriculum maps. But then it's looking at each of the standards. What is that mastery level? What's that proficiency level? What are those expectations? And then it's building towards it. So we've built instructional frameworks around each standard that include, the overall standard. It includes clarification statements, misconceptions. We're building in modeling components, like in math, or problem-solving components, manipulatives, vocabulary, all these different tools for teachers, so that then when they assess, they get our checkpoint data, which points back to what the proficiency level is that the student had by item level. So we've really gone from that overall level to standard now to item level, gives them that information so that then they can go back to those specific standards resources again and look at, okay, here's where my student's at, here's where they scored. Now let's point them to some intervention materials, and so that they can do some reteaching, some remediation, and then when the student is ready, if they desire, they could take that second opportunity, and then hopefully then there's mastery by the end of the school year.
Yeah, and just to connect what you're saying to high quality instructional materials, if you are getting information about how kids are doing on the curriculum that you're teaching, you can use that information to figure out where you need to support students so that they can access the grade level content within the curriculum that they have chosen in their district and their state. In their district and their school.
Yeah, and so these resources are helping them as they choose those new curricular resources or as they think about those other assessments that they have, if they're meeting the mark or not.
Great. So I think that one of the questions that state leaders probably have is, how do you fund a change in assessment systems? And I'm curious sort of how you all have thought about that in Indiana.
Yeah, so it does take funding, and so thankfully Dr. Jenner and a lot of us at the department, we have great relationships with our General Assembly, so very active and involved in talking with them. Again, Lindsay pointed out, all the things that we have going on for math that are in legislation. So again, that partnership, understanding the purpose and the goals that we all have. When you have 75% of the schools that are behind you in this, that's helpful as you're asking for more money. And then we were also awarded a CGSA grant. So that grant is helping us to fund a predictive model. So after each checkpoint is taken, there's that prediction model that's built in to show where students' possible successes then at the end of the year. It's also giving us some funding. We work with Cambium Assessments to deliver our assessment, and they have a tool, an API called ClearFrame that allows curriculum vendors to ingest our data into their systems, into those individualized learning platforms that they have. And so that's really exciting because currently we have a formative assessment grant in Indiana. And so schools that are using those grant funds to purchase various formative and interim assessments from these vendors, if those are going away because of our checkpoints, those other curricular materials that are connected to those assessments can still be used. So we're really excited about this possibility, and I think you're going to hear a little bit more about that in a moment.
So let's just go there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've been piloting with 3 vendors so far and hoping to have a few more that come on board next year. But what we've been doing, all of this, again, pilot year, we were still building the plane while we're flying it, right? And so they've come alongside of us, and they're having to rethink their systems on the back end because their systems are aligned, from their assessment to their products. And so they are, thankfully, and I'm very appreciative, rebuilding their systems to take our data and all the, the scale scores, the item level scores, all of that information, tying it to their courses now that they've built so that then those individualized pathways can occur.
It sounds like you're relying on partners and vendors. So can you tell us a little bit more about sort of what you're relying on partners to do?
Yeah, so partnerships are huge, relationship building, knowing the purpose, having common goals, how are we going to get there? It's been big. So like a lot of you, when you have, standards or assessment building, you have your various educators. So we have lots of educator committees all year round, lots of participation. I was looking the other day, we've had over 88 outreach opportunities so far just with presentations and professional development around our through-year system. And then we have lots of thought partners, and some of them are in the room, from Cambium to Smarter Balance to Edmetric, West Ed, Education First, Center for Assessment. Many of your assessment directors that I see at the various conferences when we talk about things are TAC. So lots of thought partners that have helped us along the way for the last couple of years as we've been designing this.
Great. This is my last question. I'm curious, sort of what does success look like in a couple of years? What do you want to see be true for teachers and for schools in Indiana?
Yeah, so we'll continue to review our data. We'll continue to take feedback. We'll continue to adjust as fast as we can. If you know Dr. Jenner, she likes things done quickly, and she's got her foot on the gas pedal. She always talks about that. And we move as fast as we can. Our students are at stake. We only have one chance, with the grade level that they're in now, and so we really think probably in 2 years we're gonna see a difference. We're gonna see this needle moving that has been talked about today too. we had 75% of the state opt-in, but we'll have 100% implementation next year. Everyone will be aware of the system, all the various resources and components to know going into year 2, and hopefully to be able to implement it with fidelity and just, again, keep moving. But the other thing that I'm really excited about is, and I think we'll be successful when we've also reached families and other community partners in the work. So, we've redesigned our student reports for families so that they can understand what the students know and can do and what those next steps are. We have a learning lab in Indiana, which is a huge hub for resources. And so we're going to be directing families there and getting more families there for them to be able to understand those reports and then use those resources. Part of that CGSA that I mentioned is also about building standard spotlights. They will be a collection of videos and educator and family guides around each one of the standards that are assessed on our checkpoints, so that when families and educators get the data, they've got that as a resource, and if a family wants to seek outside support, they could take that information to a tutor, for example, and take the report, maybe show the video, and they've got some ideas of where to help the students.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Lynn. And thanks to you all again for being here. I think the thing I would just close with is I go back to me as a teacher, and I really struggled because I didn't have good curriculum, and I had too many assessments, and no one trained me on that. So when I think about the principles behind CCSSO's report on math, they really make sense to me as an educator, and the connections between the curriculum that you use, the training that you give to teachers, and the assessment that you're asking kids to take provide you the tools, I should say, as a teacher to be successful with kids and help get them to grade level. So I just want to thank you, Lynn, for the work that you do in Indiana. I want to thank again CCSSO for elevating this topic, and it's been great to be with you all. Take care.
Thank you.
We're going to now have another spotlight on aligned research. And even though it was really good to hear the good things going on in the state of Indiana, some things I picked up, and kind of a theme that I'm hearing is alignment, simplify, align our standards with our assessments, and then I love what Lynn said about auditing your assessments. So talking with district leaders about not just adding, but what can we also take away? What things can we eliminate so that we get the best information? And then, Lynn, I also have to point out, I loved your talking about families. How you're building things to engage families too. And we all know that families are difficult in mathematics, right? We tell families it's easy to give the advice, you need to read with your children. But it's more difficult to give them advice about how to engage the family in mathematics. So thank you for Indiana leading the way. So next up, we have, again, another spotlight on aligned research, and I'm going to welcome to the stage Michelle Barrett from Edmentum. She's the Vice President of Research and Development at Edmentum. And Michelle is going to talk to us a little bit about how state leaders can help support an ecosystem of assessment and learning. And then I'd like to say, and Michelle finishes, I myself am going to have to go up to the hill for a few minutes, so I'm not going to be back in front of you. Jonathan Moore with CCSSO, I've lost Jonathan, but he is going to take over for the rest of the afternoon. I will be back about the time we start the networking reception, so I look forward to seeing all of you at the reception and at dinner tonight and learning even more about the great things that are going on in all of our states and what we're learning from each other today. But for now, Michelle, will you please come join us on stage?
All righty, it's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to start in a place of when I started as a secondary mathematics teacher. And I remember getting a bundle of score reports from a standardized assessment. They were wrapped in plastic. You guys might remember this, right? For each of the 6 classes I was teaching that semester, I had individual score reports for each of my students, and I had classroom reports that I had to make sense of. And so I spent time, I was a really eager first-year teacher. I came from a first career in mechanical engineering, so I had this inclination to be data-driven. I was also very, very eager to be an effective teacher. So here I am, super excited, digging into the score reports, trying to figure out what they meant for what my students could know and could do. I was trying to make sense of those results in relation to other assessments that I had had, to my own classroom observations. And I was there late one evening, and my principal came in and she said, "Michelle, you gotta go home. While I really appreciate your enthusiasm for this, you are gonna burn yourself out." According to a Pew survey last year, 77% of K-12 teachers say their job is frequently stressful. 68% say their job is overwhelming. 81% say there is not enough time during their regular work hours to do things like lesson planning or grading. And 84%, think about this is over 4 in 5 teachers are saying there is simply too much work. So if we go back to this scenario of trying to dig in and understand assessment results, and we're thinking about the teachers, a lot has changed since the 90s, right? We're not on paper score reports anymore. My own career has gone from being in the classroom to being much more of a psychometrician and a researcher, and then moving into this wonderful place where I get to work overseeing research and development at the intersection of curriculum and assessment and instruction, which is super exciting. State academic offices have done a lot of work to articulate standards for learning. State assessment divisions have done a lot of work to make sure that assessments are aligned to those standards. Districts and school administrators are able to slice and dice their data, given all kinds of dashboards in all kinds of different ways. Districts, as Lynn was mentioning, have really evolved a lot of their use of assessment tools. So they've got interim assessments and formative assessments. And then as we've heard earlier, universal assessments, universal screeners are also increasingly being used. We have a lot of data. We really have a lot of data. And I think that one of the things that we might tend to do, certainly as a psychometrician, I do this, as assessment specialists, sometimes as policymakers, is we say, you know what, if only the teachers understood this data, and if only the teachers could interpret these score reports well, then they would be able to effectively use the data. And I have to say, I don't actually think that that is the solution. I will never forget, I was at a conference in 2019, and this slide was put up on the screen. It's an obnoxious slide, right? It's really bright. But it's really memorable. And what the people were saying who were presenting, the presenters of this slide, they weren't saying that they didn't have enough data. What they were saying is that they had too much data. They had so much data that they actually had very little insight. And they did not know how to act upon that data. They did not know what action to take. So if you think about the job of triangulating assessment results across time, that's really hard even for advanced psychometricians. If you're looking at a single assessment, you've got things like measurement error and construct-irrelevant variance. If you're looking across assessments, you're trying to think about how well those assessments, like the degree of alignment to the state standards, and you're trying to think about the recency of the assessment, and you're trying to think about the granularity of the information that's coming through the assessment. It's really, really difficult work. And the thing is that the longer it takes us to analyze and interpret that data, that real-time data then becomes stale. When I think about the job that a classroom teacher has to do, they are trying to figure out how to act. What are the actions they need to take in order to improve learning in their classroom? An analogy for this, like you can, if you think you've got a fever, you go and you take your temperature, and you go to read the results, and then you interpret those results against the benchmark of 98.6 degrees, none of that actually is going to treat your fever. right? You can do all those things, and unless you take action, it will not treat your fever. So the job of the teacher, this is a real classroom of 30 students, measured proficiency on 5 mathematical domains. The job of the teacher is to take a look at the profile of the classroom, the profile of each of these individual students, along with other data that they might have, like the fact that half of these students come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, 6 of them require special education services, 3 of them are multilingual learners. The teacher's putting all of this information together and trying to decide what action they can take in order to have the greatest amount of learning and growth and achievement happen in their classroom. There is simply not enough time in the day to do this with the frequency required to make use of real-time assessment data. What's more is that as a teacher is doing this, the opportunity for bias can creep in. Results from a 2021 study conducted by TNTP and Zern found that students from underprivileged backgrounds were more likely to be assigned remedial work than their peers, even when they were performing similarly on grade level content. This is a problem, and it is a problem that we need to solve because research tells us that good data-driven instruction drives student outcomes. So we have got to solve this problem. You may have heard that you should have an assessment only serve a single purpose. And there are 2 states that I'm going to speak to here that have really started to challenge that status quo that I think are really providing some important models for us. So as Lynn had mentioned, both of these states are trialing assessment solutions that are both supporting the accountability systems and instructional needs. The Montana MAST solution offers frequent assessment intended to inform instruction, offered in a kind of a flexible administration manner that districts can align with scope and sequence, that also provides information that can roll in and inform and is very coherent with summative needs. Lynn was just describing and sharing some information about the Indiana checkpoints assessment system. And what is really interesting for me about the work that we've had the opportunity to do in Indiana with, in partnership with Lynn is that the understanding of how districts are using interim assessments today is actually quite strong. Indiana has had a formative assessment grant for many, many years, and as we're a provider of assessments on that assessment grant, so we provide psychometrically sound interim assessment. Teachers can use it to predict the state assessment results. They can use it to look at growth. They can use it to look at how students are performing on individual standards. And while we're really proud of that assessment, we have always operated in an understanding that we operate in this very complex ecosystem. And districts have many reasons that they're going to choose assessments and curriculums. And so we have never believed that it should be important to test students in redundant ways. So we have traditionally provided already integrations with other assessment programs into our curriculum so that we can get students learning faster without double testing them. So with really intentional learning design and with psychometric attention to validity, reliability, and fairness, we actually use the scores from assessments in order to place students automatically into research-based learning progressions. And these learning progressions include personalized digital instruction. They include teacher resources, lesson plans for teacher-led instruction, and they include curriculum-based assessments that teachers then can use in order to adapt their instruction and that the system can also use to adapt its instruction. We have ample evidence that systems like this work. When we see students using this. My team has conducted over 40 studies in the last 2 years. I still don't, I still work a lot of hours. I still haven't listened to that principle from long ago. We've conducted over 40 studies in the last 2 years, looking at the impact of systems like this on student learning across the nation, ESSA level of evidence, internal research, external researchers, and what we find is that students demonstrate exceptional growth on their interim assessments and on their state assessments when they are placed into learning progressions and are able to complete skills in this data-driven way. Here are some results from 2 of our studies. We find that the percentage of students who gain 1 or more performance levels on their state assessments happens at a much higher rate for students who are engaging in a system like this. We find growth across all student groups, statistically significant and positive growth across all student groups in our research. I cannot do justice to the details of those research studies in the short time that I have, but if you are interested in reading them, we post the full research studies along with research briefs that give key findings to this website, so feel free to find it there. All right, so back to this checkpoints pilot. As Lynn had mentioned, Cambium assessment has made it possible via an API the transition of the Indiana checkpoints data into curriculum systems. Earlier this year, my teams conducted the learning design work and the psychometric work to actually map the Indiana checkpoint scores into placement in our learning progressions. Late last month, the API opened up, and we now have teachers teaching using automated placements and curriculum-based assessments in Indiana. So far, we hear from the 5 pilot districts that we're working with a thumbs up on the experience. They're really happy not to have to double test. That is huge. So thank you, Indiana. We're happy about that too. And the teachers are happy that they can get to spend time in their instructional action space rather than in data analysis. We'll be evaluating the outcomes from this over the summer and into next year. So as state leaders, what can you do to really help students achieve exceptional outcomes in mathematics? Well, the first is to articulate that clear vision across your academic and your assessment visions. Make sure that the policies, the design, the list, the state acceptance list for curriculum that you're vetting and assessments that you're vetting, make sure that they make sense together so that they can work together. Second, allow for innovative assessment designs and uses of assessment results within your system that can help tighten that data to insight to action loop. And then partner with curriculum providers. Make sure that they do have curriculum-based assessments that are in their curriculum that teachers can use to adjust learning in real time. And finally, a plea to those teachers who are working many hours trying to analyze data, get insight, and figure out what action to take. Prioritize systems that really facilitate and streamline the process of using data, getting insight, and being able to take action. Thank you.